Folks, it was not that long ago that I showed you a video featuring the DTFc flight controller from Rotor Geeks, and it is the first one I've shown you that has a combined PDB and flight controller in one. And if you watch that video, you know that my position is that if you're going to have a PDB, a flight controller, and an OSD, and you're going to combine them some sort of way, then I'd rather go the direction I usually go, which is to have the OSD and PDB combined and the flight controller separate. But not everybody feels that way, and not everybody intends to have an OSD at all. Some people prefer to fly without an OSD, or especially if you're getting into a micro build, you may not really need an OSD. If you've got a micro build where you're going to be maxing at 40 amps wide open throttle, chances are you're not going to need to be monitoring your current that closely, and you're probably not going to be pushing the battery ultra hard like you would on a higher end 5 or 6 inch setup where you really need to pay attention to your milliamp hours relative to your voltage sag and so on. Something simple like a voltage alarm. For example, if you have a Tyrannus and you're doing VBAT telemetry, that alone might be enough to help you judge your flight times, and you don't need a full-fledged OSD. So let's ask the question, if you are going to get a combined PDB plus flight controller, what options are there out there for you? Because, of course, as soon as I did this video on the DTFc, people started pointing out other interesting products, and I think these products are worth a look to see how they stack up against the DTFc and each other, of course. Let's get into it. Now, a major thing that the DTFc has that sets it apart is that it's pin compatible with the NACE32, and therefore it stacks with the OS Doge. And if you love the OS Doge OSD and you want to keep using it, the DTFc is a clear choice. It's definitely superior to a NACE32 in every way, and it gets rid of your PDB, combines it in, and that's a great direction to go. I have to say that ever since I first saw the OS Doge, and it was one of the very, very first things to give you an OSD and PDB and voltage regulation all in one, I have always thought it was really overpriced. It just kills me to spend, at the time it was $70, maybe it's come down a bit now, it just kills me to spend that much for a product like this. Yeah, and just in the interest of being a proper, thorough, responsible reviewer, I've gone and looked it up, and sure enough, OS Doge still $70. So that seems like an awful lot to spend for what amounts to essentially an OSD, some voltage regulators, and a PDB. For $5 to $10, you can get the PDB 5-volt and 12-volt voltage regulators from a brand like Maytech, and then what do you got? You're paying $60 for an MW OSD and a 36mm form factor. I just don't see it. But not everybody agrees with me, and if you love it, this is definitely the one for you. If we look at the layout of this board, we can see it definitely, the layout is very much affected by the need to be pin compatible. So for example, the TX and the RX pads for UART1 are over here in the middle where NACE would have them, and we've got these pads over here at the edge where the motor headers normally would be, and it's all a little bit, it's not sort of the layout you would make if you sat down to design this from scratch, okay? It's the layout you would make if you had these constraints where you needed, for example, you needed these things to be here and these things to be here in order to be pin compatible. That being said, there are some things that I definitely like about it. It's 6S capable, and you've heard people like Matty Stunts and Boris B talking about how 5S is very exciting. Matty has actually sworn off 4S entirely, said he's never going back. So there's I've started saying that 5S is the new 4S. Maybe it will be. This board is up to 6S compatible, so if you decide to go to those higher voltage batteries, this board will go with you. I also want to point out that this board has a boot button, a bootloader button. The boards with bootloader pads, I'm kind of almost making that a deal breaker for me with a flight controller. And the reason for that is that some of these newer ones, you have to go into bootloader mode every time you flash the firmware. Back with the NACE32, you could flash the firmware over the bootloader without having to go into bootloader mode. You could just flash it as many times as you wanted. And it was only if you really screwed the board up in some way that you had to go into bootloader mode and short the bootloader pads. But on my X-Racer F303 and other boards I've heard from people have the same issue, you got to be in bootloader mode every time you update the firmware. And if you don't have a bootloader button, it's not going to work well for you. I do note that this bootloader button is a little set back from the edge of the board, so if this is sort of buried in a stack in your copter, it might be a little hard to get at it. You might have to go in there with a screwdriver or a pen or something to push the button. It might be a little annoying, but all in all, the button is there, and I do like that. Now for those of you who run Spectrum Satellite, you can run Spectrum Satellite through this same UART. It's just a serial protocol. There's nothing special about it. But you need to get 3.3 volts, and the place they expect you to get 3.3 volts is one of these pads, which is also where you would put your flash chip if you wanted to put a flash chip on there. Now, for some of you, that's not going to be a big deal. You're just going to solder to the pad, and you're going to get on with your life. And others of you would prefer a more convenient location, or even you'd prefer to have the actual little micro header that you plug the actual satellite plug into as opposed to direct soldering. This board doesn't have that to offer. The next one we're going to look at is the PIKO blocks or PIKO blocks from Furious FPV. This is another board that combines the PDB and flight controller in one. So how does it vary or compare to the DTFc? Well, for one thing, this is a 20mm form factor board, so it's a smaller board. So right away that tells you that this board is targeted more towards the micro builds that maybe would not be able to fit a 36mm board. And there are a few micro flight controllers that are on the market that are commonly used for those builds. But I think this one really has a lot of a beat in that it is much more similar to a sort of a standard Betaflight or standard F3 board that you would use to run Betaflight or Cleanflight, just shrunk down a little bit. If you look at the features, it has the ESC and the signal pins, and this is one thing that the DTFc does not have. If you take a look here, the DTFc has the pads here for power, but the signal wires are all right here, right? And so you've got the standard 3-row header where I'm just going to run this power to here and then the signal to over here and get ground from here. It might be a little bit of a messier build compared to this, where you've got your power and your ground and your signal, boop, right there, just coming to that one spot. You don't have any wires going across your board to loose spots or anything like that. One of the things about this is that it does not offer you a separate pad for signal ground. So if you're a person who prefers to run the ground wire for your ESC signal, you're just going to need to solder it right here to this same pad as the power ground. So be it. What else does this bring to the table? You can see here that it has the header soldered on for a Spectrum Satellite. And if you're a Spectrum user, you're going to love that. If you're not a Spectrum user, it's a complete waste of space. It's your call which way you want to think of it. It also has a buzzer built in, so you don't need to add your own buzzer here. It's I don't know, which one of these things is the buzzer? I don't know, but it says there's a buzzer built in, and that's very exciting. Just a nice little convenience feature. You don't have to figure out how to fit that. Again, especially if you're doing a micro build, it might be hard to fit that into the setup. So this is very integrated, ready to go. Got a built-in LC filter for the camera output, a power output, 2 amp 5 volt BEC. So there's no 12 volt BEC here. So if you're going to be doing some kind of a build, an FPV build, you are going to need some kind of a video transmitter that has a 5 volt power. I believe the TBS, whichever one, the TBS Unify, I think, is the one that has the it's a 5 volt input, and I think pulls about 600 milliamps, which is not going to be a problem for this one with a 2 amp BEC. So good choice there. If you have a 12 volt device, you may need to figure out some other way to get 12 volts to it. This board is not going to supply that. Incidentally, neither will any of the other boards here. I just thought of it first on this board. If we look here at this diagram, we can see that it's got pretty much your basic setup. You've got your it's very similar, for example, to the Luminaire Lux. It reminds me a lot of that. You've got a setup here where you can choose between CPPM and serial by bridging a solder pad. You've got your UARTs broken out. UART 1, UART 2, and UART 3 is used for the serial. And then you've got your basic sort of motor headers and signals and so forth. So there's also an output here for transponder if you choose to wire up an IR transponder. So if you're doing some kind of micro racing with an IR transponder, you're ready to go. About the only thing I could really complain about here is that we've got this boot pad. And again, depending on how the board is set up, you may need to short that more often than would be convenient. One would hope that the designers of the board this would be a board that wouldn't need to be in bootloader mode every time you flash it. But frankly, you use that so often that it's kind of a pain to not see a button here. And it's so hard to find a button to retrofit on a pad like this if it isn't already there. So that's a real shame that that's set up that way. So that's the PIKO blocks, and as I said before, it comes on a 20mm form factor. So what if you want it for a 36mm standard frame? Well, you can get this PDB to mount it on. So there's a PDB for your PDB. Yo dog, I heard you like PDBs. But anyway, this adapts it from the 36mm down to the 20mm size, which kind of seems silly. Why would you buy this if you didn't want a 20mm board? Why would you buy it and then adapt it to the 30mm? It's not that good, right? Because there's a very similar product, which is the Combini flight controller, which is a standard 36mm form factor, and this one I think also really has a lot of compelling offerings. So if we look at this one, we can see is a very similar layout to the PIKO blocks with the ESC power and signal right at the corners of the pad. It's got a standard button here for bootloader, very nice. It's got the satellite header, it's got the same sort of row of pins here, very similar to the other one, but it's a larger form factor. One of the things that this brings to the table is that it is up to 5S rated, so not 6S like the DTFc, but 5S rated, still pretty good. 2 amps, 5-volt output back, etc., etc. Very similar to the PIKO blocks, but in a larger form factor. This one also has a header here for connection to a OSD that Furious FPV is working on. I don't believe it's out yet. I've done a little bit of looking, but haven't been able to find any reference to it. And so in theory, in the future, this will be used to connect to an OSD that will integrate very nicely with this setup, and that's a very exciting one. We don't know about that until we get more information. Anyway, very interesting choice here at a price of $48.95. You know, if you consider that you might pay $5 or $10 for a PDB with voltage regulators on it, this is a $50 product. The flight controller itself perhaps might be in the range of $40, which is you know, there are cheaper ones out there, but I feel like a price in the range of about $25 to $40 is a fair price for a flight controller if it's got the features you're looking for, and more than that is starting to get into the I'm not sure why I would pay that much range. So there you go. There's a little rundown of these devices. And the next question that you're going to ask, of course, is which one would I pick? And I have to tell you that of these three, the DTFc is my least favorite. Number one, it straps itself to the NAS form factor so that it can be compatible with the OS Doge. But I don't like the OS Doge very much. I think, as I said, I think it's overpriced. And so I'm not a big fan of this one strapping itself to that form factor instead of a little bit of a better form factor, for example, with the signal pads and the power pads integrated so you don't have wires crossing the board. I do like that this is up to 6S capable. If I were going to run a 6S rig, this would move up in my rankings, but I'm not, and I think most of you aren't either. Like it has the bootloader button, right? Good. But the main thing that turns me off of this board is that whatever the gyro chip that they're using is, it has the same sort of glitchy problems on some people's builds that we've seen with the 6500 and the 9250, as is used in other flight controllers. And there's been a lot of debate over what the actual cause of that is. Is it the 6500 or the 9250 chip? Is it the 3.3 volt voltage regulator design? What is it? We don't know. But what we do know is that boards using the 6000 and the 6050 just don't have this problem. Like hardly ever, if ever. And so based on that, my inclination is, like, there's every chance that you would get one of these boards and it would work fine for you, but you're kind of rolling the dice, and there's people out there who have these boards who just cannot get them to fly right. And so it doesn't seem to me like I would take a chance on this board with the gyro being an unknown quantity when I know that the MCU 6000, for example, is almost certainly going to do a good job for me. And so based on those factors, I would not choose this board over the other two. The PIKO blocks it's very simple. It's a 20mm board, and if what I need is a 20mm F3 form factor board, this seems like a very, very good choice. If I want an OSD, well, I'm probably not going to run this with an OSD. I could probably find a way to hook up like a micro minim OSD or something like that, but in the kind of build where I'm putting this in, it seems like a micro minimum like kind of thing might not be a good fit, and like I might just want something like voltage telemetry to the Tyrannus and do my best based on that. And that brings us to the Combini. And this really seems like the winner between the three of them if you're going to do a general purpose full-size 36mm build. Granted, this is a pre-order product. It's not on the market yet, and so it may have some fatal flaw that damns it. But just based on the specs page, it looks like the winner. It has the MCU 6000 gyro, which means it's going to be able to run over SPI at 8 kilohertz if that's what you want to do. Certainly provides good performance there. The layout is very clean, very nice. You're not going to have a lot of wires crossing the board. It really seems like it ticks all the boxes for this application. And so I'm looking forward to seeing how this performs in the market. But for the time being, just looking at the web pages, if you're looking for a flight controller with an integrated PDB, this seems like a really good choice. Well, that's my thoughts on these boards. If you've got an additional comment or you think there's something I've missed, leave a comment down below. And as always, happy flying.